Sammy Davis Jr. had faced disrespect his entire life. But one night on stage, it crossed a line, and Dean Martin refused to stay silent. The crowd had come expecting laughter, rhythm, and the effortless charm of men who ruled the stage as easily as they ruled the room. What they did not expect was silence. Not the polite silence between songs, but the heavy, stunned kind. The kind that arrives when something goes terribly wrong in a place where joy was supposed to live. The lights were bright. The band was mid-performance. And Sammy Davis Jr., one of the most electrifying entertainers of his generation, stood center stage doing what he had always done best, giving everything he had to the audience. His voice carried confidence, pain, brilliance, and defiance all at once. He was more than a performer that night. He was a presence. Sammy had spent his entire life proving he belonged on that stage. He had grown up in the spotlight, but never been protected by it. Despite his immense talent, he lived in an era where prejudice followed him everywhere, even into dressing rooms and after parties where smiles were polite but acceptance was conditional. Yet every night, Sammy walked out anyway, dressed sharply, standing tall, daring the world to deny what it could clearly see. And that night, the room was filled with powerful people. Vegas in those days wasn't just about glamour. It was about influence, unspoken rules, and men who believed respect was something they could demand rather than earn. Certain tables in the room carried more weight than others. Certain faces were known not because of fame, but because of fear. Sammy knew this world well. All of them did. So did Dean Martin. Dean stood nearby that night, relaxed on the surface, observing everything the way he always did. To most people, he looked detached, half smiling, glass in hand, the picture of casual indifference. But those who truly knew him understood something important. Dean Martin missed nothing. He was always watching. The performance moved smoothly, the audience responding with applause and laughter, until a sudden shift rippled through the room. A voice rose, not from the stage, but from the darkness below. Loud, sharp, disruptive. Sammy faltered for half a beat. Not enough for the audience to immediately notice, but enough for Dean to feel it. Sammy's eyes flicked downward. His shoulders tightened. The band hesitated. A man had stood up near the front. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. His posture wasn't casual. It was confrontational. And in a room like that, posture mattered. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but its impact would last decades. The man moved closer to the stage. Words exchanged that were never fully captured, never officially recorded, only remembered through witnesses who later described the moment in hushed voices. And then, shockingly, he struck Sammy. Not a dramatic, cinematic blow. Not something choreographed or exaggerated. A sudden, real act of violence in a place built on illusion. The sound cut through the music like glass breaking. Sammy stumbled backward, more surprised than injured. But the humiliation landed instantly. The room froze. Some people gasped. Others looked away. A few stood, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing had happened. This wasn't just an attack on a performer. It was a test. A test of silence. A test of power. A test of whether anyone would dare to challenge what had just happened. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then Dean Martin stepped forward. The shift was immediate. Subtle, but unmistakable. Dean's relaxed posture straightened. The smile disappeared, not replaced by anger, but by something far more dangerous, certainty. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He walked. The band stopped playing. The audience felt it before they understood it. Something had changed, and it wasn't going to be brushed aside. Dean moved between Sammy and the man without hesitation, placing himself directly in the space where intimidation had just lived. Those who later witnessed the moment would say this was the most powerful thing Dean Martin ever did. Not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't need to. "This ends now," Dean said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They carried authority rooted not in fear, but in absolute refusal. The man tried to speak. Dean didn't let him finish. "You don't touch him," Dean continued. His voice calm, steady, unmistakable. "Not here. Not anywhere." The room was silent enough to hear breathing. What made the moment extraordinary wasn't just that Dean defended Sammy. It was who he was, willing to confront. In that era, standing up to powerful figures, especially in places like Vegas, wasn't just risky. It was dangerous. Careers ended quietly that way. Opportunities disappeared. Doors closed without explanation. Dean Martin knew that, and he stepped forward anyway. He didn't posture. He didn't threaten. He simply made it clear that the show and the room would not continue under those conditions. Security finally moved in, uncertain, hesitant, reading the temperature of the room before deciding who truly held control. The man was escorted away amid whispers and stunned expressions. Dean turned back to Sammy. He didn't ask if he was okay in a way that drew attention. He leaned in, spoke quietly, privately, offering something far more meaningful than words: solidarity. Sammy nodded. The audience erupted into applause, not the kind reserved for entertainment, but the kind that releases tension, that acknowledges courage when it appears unexpectedly. But the night was far from over. Because what happened on that stage wasn't just an incident, it was a statement. And it sent ripples through a world built on silence and compliance. In the next part of this story, we'll explore why this moment mattered so deeply, not just for Sammy Davis Jr., but for everyone who watched it happen. We'll look at the unspoken rules of that era, the risks Dean Martin took by refusing to look away, and how one quiet act of defiance changed the dynamic of the room forever. Because that night, the music didn't stop because of violence. It stopped because someone finally said no. In the seconds after the man was escorted away, the room didn't immediately return to normal. It couldn't. Something fundamental had shifted. Something that couldn't be undone by applause or laughter. People sat frozen, trying to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't part of the act. This wasn't entertainment. This was real power being challenged in real time. And everyone in the room understood what that meant. Sammy Davis Jr. stood still for a moment, collecting himself. Years of performing had trained him to keep going no matter what, to smile through discomfort, to finish the song even when the world pushed back. But this moment demanded something different. The shock wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It was familiar. It echoed a lifetime of moments where his talent had been undeniable, yet his dignity had been questioned. Dean Martin noticed that before anyone else did. He placed a hand lightly on Sammy's shoulder, grounding him without drawing attention. It was a small gesture, but it carried enormous weight. In that touch was a message that didn't need words. You're not alone. Not here. Not now. The band waited, uncertain. The audience waited, breath held. Dean glanced toward the musicians and nodded once. Slowly, gently, the music resumed, but not where it had left off. Dean adjusted the energy of the room, easing it back without pretending nothing had happened. He cracked a soft line, not a joke at anyone's expense, but something human, something calming. The audience followed him instinctively. Sammy stepped back into the spotlight, and when he did, the applause that greeted him wasn't polite. It was fierce, sustained, protective. That applause wasn't for the performance, it was for the man. For Sammy, that moment mattered more than most people would ever realize. He had spent his life navigating a world where acceptance came with conditions, where talent opened doors but didn't always guarantee safety or respect. He had learned to endure quietly. But that night, someone else carried the burden with him. Dean Martin had not only stopped the show, he had disrupted a long-standing expectation that certain behavior would be tolerated if it came from the right people. That was dangerous. In that era, especially in places like Las Vegas, power operated through implication rather than open threat. Everyone knew the unspoken rules. You didn't embarrass certain people. You didn't challenge authority in public. And you definitely didn't side publicly against someone who believed the room belonged to him. Dean knew all of that. He also knew something else. Silence was a choice. Behind the scenes, word spread quickly. Dressing rooms buzzed with quiet conversations. Crew members whispered. Performers from nearby stages peeked in, sensing something significant had occurred. This wasn't just about a punch. It was about boundaries being drawn, where none had existed before. Some people admired Dean immediately. Others worried for him. Not because he had acted rashly, but because he had acted clearly. Dean Martin wasn't known for confrontation. He avoided conflict whenever possible. He disliked drama. He valued peace, which made his response that night even more powerful. He didn't react emotionally. He didn't escalate. He simply refused to accept what had happened as normal. That refusal echoed. Sammy finished the set with a strength that surprised even him. His voice carried more weight, more intention. The audience listened differently now, aware that they were witnessing more than entertainment. They were watching resilience supported by solidarity. After the show, the mood backstage was subdued. There were no loud celebrations, no exaggerated laughter, just quiet acknowledgement of something important. Sammy and Dean sat together briefly, away from the noise, away from the eyes. Sammy didn't say much at first. Then he looked at Dean and said, "Thank you." Dean waved it off in the way he always did, as if it were nothing. But it wasn't nothing. For Sammy, it was rare. Someone with Dean's stature choosing to step in, publicly. Without hesitation, it mattered in ways that went beyond that night. It sent a message not just to the man who had caused the disruption, but to everyone watching. That respect was not negotiable. That message lingered. In the days that followed, people talked. Not openly, not in print, but quietly, among those who understood the stakes. Dean Martin's name was spoken with a different tone. Not just admiration, but recognition. He had crossed a line few were willing to cross. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for principle. What made it even more remarkable was that Dean never capitalized on it. He didn't tell the story. He didn't correct rumors or clarify details. He didn't let it become part of his public persona. As far as he was concerned, it was simply the right thing to do, and the right thing didn't require explanation. For Sammy Davis Jr., the impact unfolded over time. He carried that moment with him through later performances, through moments when the weight of the world pressed in again. It reminded him that he wasn't fighting alone, even when it felt that way. That allies sometimes appear unexpectedly, and when they do, they can change the entire room. The audience that night carried it too. Some would later say it was the most unforgettable moment they'd ever witnessed. Not because of fear, but because of courage. Courage without shouting. Courage without spectacle. Courage expressed through calm refusal. And that's what unsettled people the most. Dean Martin hadn't used force. He hadn't threatened. He hadn't made demands. He had simply said no, and meant it. In the final part of this story, we'll look at what this moment came to represent in the larger arc of both men's lives. How it reshaped perceptions, strengthened bonds, and became one of those quiet, defining moments that history almost forgets, but never should. Because sometimes, the most powerful stand isn't made with fists or fame. It's made by stepping forward when everyone else stays silent. By the time the night ended, it was clear that what had happened on that stage would not fade quietly into memory. It wouldn't become just another story whispered, backstage, and forgotten by morning. Something deeper had been set in motion. Something that reached far beyond one show, one confrontation, or one room filled with powerful people pretending nothing had happened. For Sammy Davis Jr., the incident lingered long after the bruises, visible or not, had faded. He had endured humiliation before. He had endured worse. But this time, something was different. This time, the moment of disrespect had been met immediately with resistance. Not from security, not from management, but from a peer, an equal, a man whose presence carried weight that could not be ignored. That mattered. Sammy understood better than most how rare that kind of public solidarity was in those days. Too often, support came quietly, privately. After the damage had already been done, people would say the right things behind closed doors, express regret, offer sympathy, while remaining silent when it truly counted. Dean Martin did the opposite. He stepped into the moment itself. And in doing so, he changed its meaning. Instead of becoming another example of something tolerated, the incident became a line that had been crossed and immediately pushed back. It sent a message not just to the person who caused it, but to everyone watching. This behavior would not be ignored, excused, or smoothed over for the sake of comfort. The aftermath was subtle but significant. People in the industry noticed a shift. Not dramatic, not revolutionary, but real. Performers felt a little less alone. Boundaries were spoken about more openly. There was an understanding, quiet, unspoken, that dignity was not optional, and that silence was no longer the default response. Dean Martin never claimed credit for any of this. He continued performing the way he always had, with ease and charm, rarely referencing the incident even when asked indirectly. Those who tried to bring it up were often met with a shrug or a deflection. To Dean, the moment didn't define him. It simply reflected him. But others remembered. Sammy remembered. In later years, when reflecting on the challenges he faced throughout his career, Sammy would often speak about the importance of allies, people who didn't just admire his talent, but respected his humanity. Though he didn't always name specific moments publicly, Those close to him knew which ones mattered most. That night was one of them. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation in return. It was about dignity being restored in real time. About someone saying, without hesitation, "This is not acceptable," and backing it up with presence rather than aggression. For the audience, the memory stayed vivid. Some had come hoping to see legends perform. They left having witnessed something far more meaningful. They saw how quickly joy could turn fragile, and how powerful it was when someone refused to let it shatter. Many would later say that it changed how they viewed Dean Martin, not because he suddenly seemed tougher or more fearless, but because he revealed a depth that the public image rarely showed. Beneath the humor and relaxed persona was a man with an unshakable sense of right and wrong, one that didn't bend under pressure. Dean Martin had always been underestimated in that way. People mistook his calm for indifference, his humor for detachment, his avoidance of conflict for weakness. But that night made one thing unmistakably clear. Dean didn't avoid confrontation because he was afraid of it. He avoided it because he didn't believe in unnecessary force. When something truly mattered, he stood firm. And he stood tall. The significance of that moment grew with time. As the years passed and perspectives changed, it became easier to see how rare such acts of courage had been in environments built on hierarchy and fear. Standing up wasn't just a personal risk, it was a professional one. Dean knew that, and he accepted it without hesitation. That acceptance is what transformed the incident from a shocking interruption into a defining moment. Sammy Davis Jr. went on to continue breaking barriers, continuing to perform with brilliance, humor, and resilience. But moments like that one reminded him and everyone watching that respect didn't have to be begged for. It could be demanded calmly and decisively by someone willing to step forward. Dean Martin, meanwhile, continued his career much as before, never seeking praise for his actions. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who refused to let a colleague be diminished in front of him. And sometimes, that's all heroism really is. The story endured not because of the violence, but because of the response. Not because someone struck another man, but because someone else refused to let that act define the room. The punch itself faded into history. The stand did not. Today, when people look back on that era, they often focus on the glamour, the excess, the music, and the legends. But beneath all of that were moments like this, moments that revealed character when the spotlight shifted unexpectedly. That night, the spotlight found Dean Martin not because he sought it, but because he stepped into it for someone else. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching, then and now, that real power isn't about intimidation. It's about refusing to stay silent.